When we have a mismatch or a gap between the supply of employees and the need of employees, sort of the difference between our demand and our and what we need, those shortages or overages could be temporary or permanent. When we have temporary talent shortages, it doesn't mean that we're going to have a long-term problem. It just means we have a particular gap or a particular need to hire people, and this is not a sort of a long-term problem that we have. So what we can do is offer hiring bonuses. New hires typically demand higher salaries, but sometimes you can offset that by saying, here's a bonus for signing on, and then you have them sit at the salary that they would have normally as everybody else. And so this way the inducement is only a short-term cost rather than a higher salary, which is a long-term compounding cost to the organization. Sometimes when there are talent shortages, companies will use search firms, or they'll use different standards for hiring, sort of lowering their standards because they feel like there's just not enough employees out there. If this is only a temporary situation, you don't need to go to drastic measures, because oftentimes the expensive recruiting methods aren't necessarily going to get you the candidates that you need, nor does it benefit the company to lower your hiring standards, even if it's just temporarily to get a warm body in the job. Unless, of course, again, you're like McDonald's, where somebody who can read and write is more than enough, for hiring purposes. But the goal here, really, with a temporary talent shortage is you don't want to spend an enormous amount of money because it's a temporary situation. It's sometimes what it takes really is a creative solution, whether it's a hiring bonus or creatively looking to non-traditional sources that you didn't consider before for hiring. But either way, the temporary shortage is exactly that. It's temporary. So be incredibly careful that you're not setting yourself up for long-term problems like lower quality employees and higher levels of turnover, or higher level costs that don't necessarily yield you the candidate that you want. For a persistent talent shortage, we run into definitely a far more difficult solution. And your textbook talks about maybe reducing the demand for the talent so that you can, maybe automate the work or redesign the work or retrain and repurpose your workers in a different way. You can also engage in what we call business process reengineering, where you change the flow of work so that you could also get away with fewer employees. Another option that they talk about is increasing the supply of the qualifications that it needs. So it means investing in the local community, investing and training people in the local community who would then turn around and be hired by you at a later date. This takes a lot longer to facilitate, although it would help you meet perhaps affirmative action plan requirements if you want to do active affirmative action plans. Fundamentally, though, a long-term shortage means you need to be really creative in thinking about different ways to manage that shortage, because it may be a permanent shortage. So one thing to think about is, again, like the example I gave with Trek bicycles, is going to a different industry and across industry to find comparable skills and recruit where there are layoffs with other industries. And get those people to come work for you. And at the higher level or more skilled level workers, this is something that's reasonable and feasible. But for lower level skilled workers, it may not be as feasible an option. So you may then turn to more automation or business process reengineering to rethink the way that work flows so that you can use less employees and teach them to work more efficiently and not just effectively. When we have a temporary surplus of employees, which basically for a short term period of time we have more employees than we need, there's a whole host of different things that we can do. We could do work slowdowns, if that makes sense, or we could have temporary workers come in, or treat them as if they're temporary workers. If we know that we may have some cyclicality in our work, why hire permanent people? Hire people who are seasonal, hire people who can float with the cycle. But when we are suddenly faced with a surplus that we couldn't plan for, that it's not based on business cyclicality, might be based on the economy or any number of other issues, slowing people down, having everybody work slightly less hours. So you sort of share the burden with everybody. That is a good way to think about this. And again, also protecting your core workers by getting rid of your flexible workers, getting rid of your part-time workers, getting rid of your temps, getting rid of your contingent workers, whoever they are. If you're going to have a temporary layoff that may last 6 months or more, then you can think about, doing a layoff, because if you do short-term layoffs, if you're only going to have a small period of time, maybe 2 months or 3 months, that you predict having a surplus of workers, it doesn't make sense financially to do a layoff. You have to expect that this temporary slowdown could be anywhere from 6 months to a year. When it's 6 months to a year, then it really does make sense to do the layoff, and a temporary layoff where those people can then be recalled later when the workload increases or when demand changes. And the reason why we want to have at least a 6 month situation where there's a temporary surplus before we do a layoff is because the costs for doing layoffs are astronomical, right? It's the cost for severance, it's the cost for unemployment insurance, it's the cost for productivity declines and people who then are going to get rehired back. So, we want to be careful of, if we're going to do this, it needs to be because there's a sort of a mid-range time frame that makes sense. A temporary surplus for a month or 2 months, not a big deal, right? A temporary surplus for 6 months or more, then the layoff makes sense. If it's more than a year, then you're really talking about a persistent surplus, and you have to change your plan around that. The other thing that we can do instead of layoffs is maybe salary cuts or, as I said, across the board reduction in hours. This way, again, everybody shares in the burden, and not any one particular group is taking on the burden of being laid off or getting a salary cut or anything along that line. So yes, when there is a permanent surplus, we do have to take more drastic measures. This means that there's a decrease in business, or the economy is shrinking, or any number of issues could be contributing to this. So you can do general layoffs, you can do early retirement incentives, you can do attrition, meaning that when someone retires or leaves the company, you don't replace that position. It's a way of sort of stabilizing your workforce without directly affecting those who might be very productive workers, but you don't want to lose them. And so the goal here really is to be thinking creatively about longer term solutions to address your problem. And sometimes layoffs or downsizing is unavoidable. Sometimes companies have to shrink in size because they've gotten too big, or because their product market is no longer viable, or their customer base is ignoring them and walking away from them for any host of reasons. There's greater competition, so we don't have as much market share anymore. All these are important things. It's always important to at least start thinking about what are some short-term solutions that you can do to address things, and not immediately go to the layoff, because again, a layoff costs money, and it costs a lot of money when you start having to pay for the increase in cost for unemployment insurance and things like that. But if you can manage your short-term surplus, and hopefully strategically manage your company in such a way to get it back on the right path in a short term, then you're in a better place. But if you recognize that this is a long-term strategic problem for the company, and you've got this long-term surplus, you're going to have to think about downsizing, right-sizing your company, changing the way workflows are happen and stuff like that to make that work. So, if you can, you want to do outplacement services for people to help them retrain for different kinds of jobs. And when gaps open up, when there are vacancies, if you can take people who used to work there or who are working in one department, retrain them to work in another area, you're starting to work internally with finding a way to repurpose your employees in a way that keeps them there, keeps them employed, keeps them loyal to you. So once we understand our gap, and whether our gap is a surplus or a shortage, we have to then think about what our staffing planning looks like. Whether, again, this involves, general layoffs, or whether it involves having to really think non-traditionally about how to recruit the talent that you need. You have these three major questions that you need to ask. Number one, how many people should we recruit or lay off if that's the situation? But really, let's think about this from the affirmative, that we have a shortage and we need to bring people in, hence the staffing planning. We need to, to hire more people. How many people do we need to recruit? So we need to be thinking about our staffing yields or our hiring yields. This is where you use those yield ratios in recruitment, and you are looking at how many people you had at every step in the process, in terms of what your yield ratios were, so that you can demonstrate that you understand, in order to hire 5 people, I've got to recruit 150 to find 5 qualified people. And if it's a skill that is easily had, you may need to recruit less people to be able to hire the amount of people that you need. So, the ratio is really dependent on how many gaps you have, and the rarity of that skill set. More rare skills require us to recruit more people, and more common skill sets make it easier for we can recruit less people. Once we figure out how many people we should recruit and utilizing our staffing and hiring ratios, then we have to figure out what resources do we need. For example, workload-driven forecasting is based on historical data of the average number of hires, and then we can also do staffing efficiency, which is usually the total cost with associated with the compensation of a newly hired employee. So we use these different ratios to be thinking about use forecasting data, or we might think about what it will cost to bring in somebody new based on what the going salary rates are. You also want to think about how much time this is going to take, whether you're going to be ongoing recruiting all the time, particularly if you have a position that there's regular turnover. McDonald's tends to have continuous recruiting because they're constantly have a turnover. Customer service jobs have constant turnover. Restaurant work in general has a lot of turnover. Or you can do batch recruiting, where you do a batch based on a particular need at a particular time. The higher up you go in the organization, the more likely you are to engage in batch recruiting, because it's about recruiting for a particular position. It's not an ongoing issue. But if you have lower level positions, that tends to be more continuous recruiting. So this slide is a great illustration of the staffing yield pyramid. In essence, it gives you a visual for the first point made in the previous thing about what kind of ratios do we need to consider when we are hiring people. So we'll start at the top of the pyramid first to establish what we need. And at the top of the pyramid, you can see that we need 75 hires. All right. So what that means is, if you go all the way down, based on the yield ratios, we know we need 2,000 applicants, because of those 2,000 applicants, 1/4 of them, or 500, will get an invitation for an interview. Of those that got an invitation, 4/5 of them will actually interview with us. So there's probably 1/5 of them or 100 of them that will decline the interview after they've learned something about our company, or perhaps they got another offer, and so they don't want to interview after all. After that 4/5, then we go down to, of those that we interviewed, 100 of them get offers. And so we know that we're historically making about an offer to about 1/4 of the employees that we actually interview. And then of that, most of them will hire. 3/4 of them we will hire. So this just gives you a great sort of simplistic visual of why we need to do the yield ratios, because if we know that we need to hire for a certain number of vacancies, that means we have to work backwards to how many do we have to source, recruit, pre-screen, get through interviews and other selection assessments, and ultimately make an offer to. And not only have them make the offer, but have them accept the offer and start the job. And certainly we can go deeper into these yield ratios by arguing how many of them actually start the job, and then how many actually stay 6 months or more. This here is a great visual of what the hiring timeline looks like. For example, we know that it takes us 14 days to get all the applicants that we want. And then it takes another 7 days to do a telephone assessment of those applicants to decide which ones we want to bring on site for an interview. It takes us 7 days to go through the interview process. And then it takes another 7 days to make offers to people and have them reply to that offer. Another 14 days for the job offer to be accepted, because sometimes people need to take some time to think about it. And then lastly, get them involved in pre-job training. So you can see in terms of your timeline that you need to be considering about 7 weeks to set up. So working backwards, how long does it take for each of these steps in the process, so that we know if I need somebody filled by September 1st, I've got to work 7 weeks back. And that would put me, say, mid-July, right, to be able to make to start my recruiting and hiring process. And so obviously, if we are filling a vacancy, we want our applicants to know how long the timeline is before a hiring decision is made. But also, having this hiring timeline is really important when we are forecasting future needs and future growth. So if I know by January 1st, I have to have a whole host of employees ready to go in a new department, then I need to make sure I have my hiring timeline set up so that I can work backwards and know at what point in time should I start recruiting for certain positions, because obviously there's going to be a big push to attract, pre-screen, select, and place, and get on board our new employees, and then of course get them through whatever orientation training and things like that needs to happen. So these hiring timelines come in handy so that it helps us with communicating to our applicants so that they know what to expect in terms of the timeline, and it helps us with respect to our own staffing planning when we need to think about future needs and how long it will typically take us to recruit and hire and train new hires. One of the key factors that we have to consider in terms of our metrics is return on investment. And in order to determine return on investment, we need to know what it costs to hire an employee. So there's a whole host of costs that we should take into account. Number one, advertising expenses, whether we're advertising with an employment agency or whether, or in the newspaper or on the internet, or even internally, is there a cost to advertising? Then, of course, using agencies and search fee firms, what the cost is to use them. If you're doing referral bonuses, for example, if you're asking your employees to recommend people, you might give them a $100 or $200 bonus for hiring somebody for recommending somebody that we hire and stays on for 6 months or more. There is the cost to send recruiters out to locations, if that's appropriate. Oftentimes we see that with college hiring, where we go to the college campus, and it costs us to stay in a hotel, to have a table at the college fair, to the job fair, and the meals and all the things that go along with all the advertising costs and stuff like that go along with that. Then there's the relocation cost. Now, this is not always a cost that we will negotiate with employees. This is a variable cost, but if you are paying for relocation costs, then of course you have to consider that. Then there's the company recruiter cost directly itself. Basically, the person it's the prorated salary of the individual who does all the administrative duties for the recruiting process. So I like the example here on this slide where it says the Saratoga Institute adds an additional 10% to cover miscellaneous expenses, including testing, reference checks, hiring, manager time, and administrative support. So in your budget, assume that there's about a 10% overhead cost for just managing the recruiting process in and of itself. This also doesn't include the cost for reference checking, because there may be a cost to that. Like if you're doing a background check, there's a cost to pay somebody to do a background check. But when we're thinking about the cost per hire, background checks, anything that costs us, the testing that costs us, we have to take that into account. Lastly, if we are hiring internal candidates, there is absolutely a cost to hire them, although it is significantly less than it would be for hiring external candidates, as I'm sure we all are aware. But there are things that we have to consider. Number one, the internal advertising costs, the cost to put advertisements up in the job board in the company. There's an internet board where people can go on from an intranet and locate it. So there's some administrative costs to manage that. There's the costs if you're going to do a flyer and distribute things via mail or internet email to people. If you have multiple sites and you are bringing someone internally from one location to another, then there's the internal travel costs and interview costs for that, because that is downtime that person is not doing their job in another location. So there's the cost, the opportunity cost for them to interview with you, but it results in decreased productivity in their current job. Then if they're moving from one location to another, there's the relocation aspect of things. And then lastly, what it costs for the internal recruiter's time. And this may be related to who the internal recruiter is, if it's under the staffing function, or the cost to manage the internal database of skills through the training and development function. But either way, we want to have a clear assessment of what that cost is internally. So in terms of planning, it's really important that we understand the gap that we're going to have, whether it's a surplus or a shortage. And then when we are ready to do our staffing planning, we're going to make sure that we are looking at our yield ratios and starting to develop our staffing plan in place. And so as we start thinking about staffing planning, as you move into recruitment and selection in Module 3, we'll be thinking about this as it applies to your simulation project. So be thinking about ratios and things like that as we start thinking about how many people you want to recruit and hire for your simulation.